to our session against state deception and terror. I hope you can hear me at the back. So you have two presenters today, and then hopefully we'll have some good discussion. I'm the first presenter, and I'm Graeme MacQueen. I'll introduce myself in a moment. Second will be Barrie Zwicker. Mainly 9/11 is going to be our focus, but really we'll be trying to give some context for that and studying more widely the kinds of acts of state deception that 9/11 belongs to, kind of category to which it belongs. All right, who am I? Peace activist for pretty much all of my adult life. Also involved in environmental issues and taught at McMaster University for 30 years. I was a founding director of the Center for Peace Studies at McMaster. And I guess the last thing I would say is my involvement in the issue of 9/11 and what happened on that day is really something that's occupied me a great deal for the last 5 years. So I got into it later than Barrie, but am fully into it now, and I'm very disturbed that some of the progressive social movements in this country continue to ostracize people who have questions about 9/11 and similar incidents. That we are to some extent taboo, not only to the establishment, but even to the movements that we cherish and that we've contributed to for many years. I think that's unfortunate and dangerous, and really want to make a plea for these social movements of dissent getting together and sharing their ideals and their information. I want to begin by introducing a term. Part of the point of today really is to introduce concepts that could be useful to you, which is increasingly being used by people that do our kind of work. SCAD, State Crimes Against Democracy. I'll give a definition of it, the definition used by the guy that has really invented the term. SCADs are concerted actions or inactions by government insiders intended to manipulate democratic processes and undermine popular sovereignty. They are high crimes that attack democracy itself. Now, why would we bother with this term? You know, in part, we need to invent our own concepts and our own terms. Many of the terms used in public discourse are, among other things, very pro-state, tilted in favor of the state. So, for example, the concept of terrorism, although you and I will insist on using the term state terrorism, it's barely made it into the lexicon as far as the mainstream media is concerned. As far as the political parties are concerned, it doesn't exist. Terrorism is something that non-governmental groups do. So Hezbollah does terrorism. The State of Israel maybe uses force. And this is a big pro-state bias. And that's one of the reasons we have to decide whether we're going to use the term terrorism or not. I don't use it anymore. And you all know this, but perhaps some of you haven't realized that the term conspiracy theory is the same. It's got an enormous pro-state bias, which is why I get so upset when people in social movements use it against us. If I think, for example, that Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda have conspired to carry out the acts of 9/11, which is the official story, I don't get called a conspiracy theorist. That's not a conspiracy theory. Why? Because we know that groups like that conspire all the time to do evil things. There's no point calling it a conspiracy theory. But if I say that a state, and especially a Western state like the US, has people within it who conspired to do those deeds, then suddenly I'm a conspiracy theorist. In other words, states don't do it, especially our states. Pro-state bias, the same as with terrorism. Very dangerous term to dismiss people who dissent from the official narrative, so I don't use it. The term SCAD, State Crimes Against Democracy, is used partly to refocus ourselves on what states do regularly. Now you see this is a very broad definition, includes many things. It would include, for example, the stealing of 2 presidential elections by the Bush crew. They would be SCADs. But the kind of SCAD that we're interested in today are false flag operations. Like all of these state crimes, they are deceptive by their very nature, because those embedded in the state wish to deceive society at large about what they're doing. But false flag operations also involve violence or the threat of violence. Essentially, a false flag operation is where, let us say, I attack one of you, but do so fraudulently, deceiving you about my identity. So I attack you and say that he's the one that did it. So I'm attacking you while flying a false flag. You see the point? Barrie will say more about those operations in his talk. But false flag operations are simply one form of SCAD, of state crimes against democracy. In addition to using terms like this that help correct for the pro-state bias, I'm especially disturbed that progressive social movements don't look into these movements, because we, in these progressive social movements, are one of the main targets of these kinds of action. That is to say, our attempts to change social priorities are one of the main things that they attempt to undercut. Some of you will remember that public protest and nonviolent direct action and so on came to a beautiful crystallization in 1999 at the battle in Seattle, protesting the World Trade Organization. This represented a new upsurge of protests at what global elites were doing, and began to catch on and to catch the imagination of many people in the public who hadn't thought about these things before. Because nonviolent direct action and public protests can be dramatic, they can be symbolically powerful. One of the things 9/11 did was take back the initiative for the elites. It said, you want drama? We'll show you drama. We're going to crash planes into buildings. We're going to have people leaping from quarter of a mile high. That's drama. You want drama? And so violence managed to get back the stage. And I think many people in social movements felt as if they'd been hit in the gut, not only because of all the violence and destruction, but also because somehow nonviolence had yet again been thrown into the background. So one of the things, and by the way, this was done quite explicitly on 9/11. If you watch the CNN coverage, old Alexander Haig, former Secretary of State, is sitting there, and they're asking him what the significance of this day is. Events are still unfolding. And he says, well, you know, Americans have been talking a lot lately about social justice and how important social justice is. But today we see, kind of almost gloating, we see that that's not our priority. Terrorism has to be our priority. And you could see then this shift, this redefining of our social priorities going on. Possibly one of the most dramatic cases of this sense in which SCADs are used to target what we do happened in 2005 when there was a magnificent protest in Scotland against the G8, which was happening at that time. And what happened? The London bombings happened. So we had bombs in the underground, and we had this destroyed bus. I think you can see it, the roof blown off. We had 50-some people killed in this set of actions. Supposedly 4 young Muslim men with backpacks had detonated their charges, killed themselves and many other people, thereby showing that it's not only foreign Muslims that are dangerous, it's homegrown Muslims, boys that grew up in the UK. They can't be trusted either. Well, if you think I'm implying this was another false flag attack, I am. I believe it was completely phony. I've included 2 or 3 items on the bibliography to get you started if you haven't looked into it. And it's only one of many such actions. Therefore, we in social movement, and again, people in Scotland who'd been marching felt like they'd been punched in the gut. That suddenly all this magnificent protest, which was gathering well-deserved public attention, had been swatted down again, and once again the world had been told, you guys aren't where it's at. It's terrorism that we have to fight. That's where the money goes. You know, surrender your civil rights. This has got to be the top priority. Now, in my time that remains, I want to look very briefly at 2 false flag attacks that took place in the United States in the fall of 2001. Obviously, in the amount of time I have, oh, and by the way, I should have explained, My talk's half an hour, Barrie's will be half an hour, and then we have some discussion. Obviously, in that amount of time, I can't give a lot of detail. What I want to do is use the anthrax attacks, initially, to illustrate to you some of the methods the state uses, typically in false flag attacks. Then, I'll go on briefly to 9/11, concentrating on the destruction of the buildings in the World Trade Center, trying to illustrate some of the methods we use to counter propaganda. Again, being very selective. Well, first the anthrax attacks. I don't know how many of you even remember them, because we're not encouraged to remember them anymore, but they were a big deal when they happened. Starting a week after 9/11, on September 18th, 2001, a letter was sent out with anthrax spores, as well as a threat inside it. Altogether, at least 7 letters were sent out to the media and to 2 Democratic senators. 5 people died, 22 were infected, and it was a big deal at the time, because it was widely assumed that we were dealing with a 1-2 punch, that 9/11 had been the first punch by these foreign Muslim extremists, and that the anthrax attacks were essentially by the same group, and they constituted the second punch. I want you to pause for a minute and look at the first letter, which we received during these anthrax attacks. So we see the date, 09/11/01. It says 9/11 right at the top. It was not sent on 9/11, it was sent later. And by the way, another letter sent a couple of weeks later had exactly the same date, written the same way at the top. These people are trying to tell us they are the same people that did 9/11. This is next. Take penicillin now. Penicillin spelled wrong. Death to America, death to Israel. Allah is great. I mean, as somebody who taught comparative religion for years, I don't know whether to laugh or be offended by this cheap forgery. But in any case, this was taken widely to be genuine at the time. But this was obviously the message here is, we are extremist Muslims who've come to your land. We want to hurt you. We want to scare you. We want to create as much damage as we can. We're scary, and you should fight us. And this message managed to gain a lot of momentum during October of 2001. It became clear that the people who were being set up to be the perpetrators were Al-Qaeda, who were supposed to be the crude outfit that didn't know how to spell penicillin, and which actually wrote the letters and delivered them, and that the very, very sophisticated anthrax spores inside the envelope, which couldn't have been made by Al-Qaeda, had been provided by Iraq. So this was an Al-Qaeda-Iraq operation, and therefore we must mobilize ourselves not only to invade Afghanistan. The invasion of Afghanistan began, I think it was 3 days after the first anthrax victim died, but also we must begin mobilizing to invade Iraq. And the connection to these letters was made very, very explicitly. Now, as opposed to many false flag operations, this one began to unravel very quickly. This story about Iraq and Al-Qaeda, which I'm going to call Story A, began to disintegrate already in November of 2001. And by January 2002, Tom Ridge of the relatively new Department of Homeland Security felt that he had no choice but to say publicly, we are now looking, unfortunately, at a domestic source of this anthrax, which is a polite way of saying it looks like this was an inside job. And the reasons they concluded that go beyond my talk today. Most of them were scientific. They had to do with the strain of the anthrax, the AIM strain, largely an American strain of anthrax, never in the hands of Iraqis or Al-Qaeda. Had to do with the preparation of the spores, highly sophisticated weaponized anthrax spores, prepared in a particular way with electrostatic charge and silicon dioxide coating on the spores and all sorts of things, which were actually more reminiscent of American anthrax preparation than Iraqi preparation.